Keeping the muscles strong and long is something that's always a constant debate. What's the best way to do that? Okay, well, there's three ways that we use our muscle tissue. Three separate ways. The way that we generally become most familiar with when we're growing up is pumping, using repetitive motions. So if somebody were to ask us when we were young teenagers and we said, how do you get strong? Most of us would probably assume that we want to lift weights, do push-ups, do repetitive actions that will strengthen our muscle tissue, our skeletal muscles. The more push-ups we do, the stronger our pectorals. The more curls we do, the stronger our biceps. This is true. This is a fact. But that doesn't mean necessarily that that makes for the healthiest muscle. When we do that type of repetitive action, whether in sport or with weights, we're doing something that's called concentric shortening. Concentric shortening. That means we're shortening our muscle fibers. We're making them bulkier, depending how much weight and how long we do it for. We're making them bulkier, and we're making our muscles less flexible. Always, when we shorten the muscle over time, and it can take years, but we're making the muscle less flexible. And there are problems associated with that. Obviously, it's healthier to strengthen our muscles and do these type of activities than to do nothing at all. I would always recommend strengthening rather than just being sedentary. But there are problems with over-strengthening. We can eventually, when we get older, get arthritis. We can also really limit the mobility, especially at the shoulders, the lower back, and the hips. All the areas that we're feeling the gravity pull down on us, the large, bulky muscles at the joint space, these little spaces, will have very limited mobility. You might have seen certain bodybuilders who cannot get their fingers anywhere close to their shoulders because of tight lats, tight biceps, and other shoulder muscles. So might be as far as they can bring their fingers towards their shoulder, or might be as far as they could lift their arm up just to here. Doesn't seem like a big deal at a certain point in life, but later on it does become a little bit of a problem. So that's called concentric shortening, repetitive motions. The opposite of that would be just stretching. Now, yoga is often associated with stretching. Anybody who does yoga on a regular basis knows that it's much more than that. But a lot of forms of yoga, or I should say a lot of ways that people practice yoga, sometimes is simply stretching muscle tissue. Taking the hamstring muscles, for instance, in the back of our thigh, or the shoulder muscles, and then stretching the muscle tissue as much as you possibly can over the course of time every day, in which case you do get more flexible. This can be good. More flexible muscle prevents injury, generally. It also, a lot of people don't know, the more flexible a muscle is, the easier it is then to tone the muscle. A flexible muscle will tone about 30% quicker than a tight muscle will if we do the same activity. So flexibility is good. But if we have flexibility without the balanced strength around the joint, whether shoulder, knee, or elbow, then we're asking for trouble. We sometimes run into what's called hypermobility, where our shoulder joint or our knee or hip gets so flexible, we could bring it all the way back, we could do all these trick movements with it, whatever we're doing, and yet we don't have the strength to keep it in place. We've all heard of dislocated shoulders. We've all heard of trick knees. These things can be a real problem when it comes to our joints. So we want strength and flexibility. That brings us to the third way that we use our muscles. We already talked about strengthening with repetitive motion, the first way. The second way, stretching. The third way, and this is the way that we'll be coming back to all day, possibly the main theme of this lecture, I'd say. It's called eccentric lengthening, the opposite of concentric shortening. So this would be concentric shortening, constantly pulling up here, or lifting ourselves quickly on a bar, on a chin bar. Eccentric lengthening is the opposite. Eccentric lengthening, we're actually strengthening a muscle while we stretch the muscle. So when I mention this in different anatomy workshops and in yoga classes, people kind of perk up. Eccentric lengthening. How do we stretch a muscle while we're strengthening it? It seems counterintuitive, right? But there really is a way. The easiest way to visualize this is with the bicep muscles once again. I'll do a brief visual here, and then we'll use a yoga model to show it in actual postures. So, would you throw me that block? Thank you. All right, so let's imagine that this block is a heavy weight. If this block were a heavy weight and I was holding this load and I wanted to bring the weight towards my shoulder, one of the main muscles I'd be using would be my bicep muscle, as we all are familiar with. Maybe the main muscle, depending on who you are. But if I do this, as we talked about earlier, I'm flexing the elbow joint and I'm concentrically shortening my bicep muscle. So I'm shortening the muscle to lift up the weight. Obviously, that means I'm strengthening the muscle. If I do it repetitively every day, I'm tearing down muscle tissue. That creates bulk. Now, what about the opposite though? If we don't think of the lowering, then we're missing most of the equation. So even as I lower this heavy weight, my bicep muscle here is still working. Gravity is pulling it down, but I'm not just letting it drop. I have to lower it slowly, or I would like to lower it slowly, I should say. By lowering the weight slowly, my bicep muscle is stretching while it's strengthening. Once again, this is called eccentric lengthening. I'm lowering it against the force of gravity, still exerting my willpower, somatic nervous system, to lower it slowly, but strengthening while it's lengthening. Okay, so if we get an understanding today, and when we practice this at home again and again with yoga asana and Pilates postures and movements and flows and sequences, if we can get a good understanding of how we can eccentrically lengthen the most important muscles in our body, then we really have something. Because then we can free ourselves of a lot of distractions in our body. Areas that we might feel tight or weak, or joint spaces that are not stable. When we can focus on the eccentric lengthening of these areas, then we can get stronger and yet more flexible at the same time. This is not to say that every posture you do in yoga or Pilates has to have eccentric lengthening, but the more familiar you are with it, the better.